Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are joined by Rabbi Shmuel Phillips, and we are going to be doing yet another tshuva, or Iggeres, of the Rambam. Now, Rabbi Shmuel Phillips was born and raised in England. He spent over 2 decades studying and teaching in yeshivos and kolim in Eretz Yisrael, during which time he has also completed a law degree from the University of London. Rabbi Phillips currently resides in Rechavia, Yerushalayim, with his wife, Rivka, and 4 children. There he divides his time between Torah teaching and study and managing a suite of serviced offices in downtown Yerushalayim. That's the first time I had that on a guest bio, so I think we're in for quite a diversity of ideas and experiences. Not to mention, I think we said
you sound very exciting.
Well, it's not a business podcast, but maybe. So we are going to be doing a tshuva of the Rambam. Now, the thing is, when I think about tshuvas of the Rambam or letters of the Rambam, I think maybe about that previous episode we had about 2 episodes ago. We did the Iggeres Teiman, his epistle or letter to Yemen, or his Iggeres Hashmad. And in terms of the halachic ones, I would generally think about his tshuva about whether you stand for the Aseres Adibros, the 10 Commandments when they're read in shul. What happens when there's a lot of talking during Chazaras Hashatz? Can we make any adjustments? Or perhaps can you teach Torah to Muslims or Christians, to non-Jews? But what we're looking at is really a tshuva that I personally have never seen in my life. And it actually, I think it picks up in the middle of a story. So, Rabbi Phillips, maybe tell our audience, tell our listeners, what exactly is the topic of this tshuva we're about to look at? And what is the story we're picking up in the middle of?
First of all, thank you so much for having me on your wonderful podcast. Hope I can do this to Shiva justice in the time we have available this evening. The first question is why this teshuvah? Why any teshuvah of the Rambam altogether? And it's important to note when we look at the Rambam's got somewhat of a reputation for being this cold, rationalist, people call him. If you read his main works, his Perush on the Mishnah, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Mishnah Torah, these come over as cold, very, very technically presented, academic style works. And you always think of the Rambam as this professor sitting there in the room writing out his works. And also, when we think of them in yeshiva, we read out these lists. So there's the Rambam, the Rif, the Rosh. He says that, there's here that. When we read the letters of the Rambam, we see a totally different dimension to him. We see him, some of the letters, some of the teshuvas you mentioned, the Iggeres Teiman, the Iggeres Hashmad, we see him as a concerned community leader. With the letter to Avadia Hager, another famous one, we see him, his warm personality, his real concern for Avadia. And the same we can say a little bit about the Iggeres, the letter we're going to see tonight, the teshuvah we're going to see tonight. We see his powerful personality shining through, and certain small nuggets which can be spotted in his letters, which I don't think one really sees in the Mishnah Torah, on the Moreh Nevuchim. So the letter we're going to look at this evening, as you said, is one of a series, and the background is, first of all, the topic is whether one can travel on a river on Shabbos. Not whether they can get on a boat. There are certain issues about getting on a boat on Shabbos, starting a journey on Shabbos. There are rabbinic prohibitions about getting on a boat on Shabbos. We're assuming you've already got on the boat before Shabbos. There's a separate halacha called the halacha of Tichun, which means whether one can go a certain distance outside one's location, outside one's town, whether it's a 12 mil midoraisa on the biblical law, 2,000 amos under rabbinic law. You cannot travel more than a certain distance outside your locale.
Right, and this is separate from when we think about carrying in terms of an Eruv. This is just an issue of traveling, whether I'm carrying or not.
Right, that is correct. And as we're going to see, the Rabbanim in Bovel, with whom Rambam he's writing this teshuvah to a student who's in Bovel. So the Rabbanim in Bovel passing in this one way, they were strict in this matter. They would not allow Jews to travel on boats on Shabbos, which was a major way of traveling in this medieval period at the time. Whereas the Rabbanim in Spain and North Africa did permit the Jews to travel. And what's particularly interesting here, in terms of we talk about the community side, we see the Rambam as a community leader. is that there was a certain shift happening in the Jewish world at the time. As we know, after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, Jewish scholarship, the yeshivas, gradually shifted over to Bavel. We had the Amoraim, we had the yeshivas of Sura, Pompedisa, and Nardea. That all the scholarship was really centered around Bavel. The Bavli was completed there. We had the Gaonim. Yep. By the time we move over to sort of the 11, 1200s, the center of Jewish scholarship is now Europe and North Africa somewhat. So there's a shift that goes on, and the Rambam and this Rosh Hashiva in Bavel are really corresponding, or the student in Bavel are really corresponding at this time, where Bavel, the Reish Galusa in Bavel, who's this Rosh Hashiva of Shmuel Halevi in Baghdad, believes that Bavel is the primary place of authority, and that the rest of the Jewish world is bound to follow the psak, the rulings of the rabbis in Bavel. Whereas the Rambam is pushing back against this, and he is writing to a student, and the student wrote to him. First of all, he moved from, I think it was Egypt, which was in North Africa, to Baghdad, where the rabbis there are not permitting him to travel on the rivers. And he's writing his letters to the Rambam saying, well, what's going on? Well, we always learned from you that it is permitted to travel on the rivers on Shabbos. I've moved to Bavel, and people, they're yelling Shabbos at me and throwing stones at my
Right, it's like,
bed.
let's say you grew up in Deal, New Jersey, and then you moved to some other community in America, and like you start riding your bike, and people are giving you looks.
Right, so the Rambam writes this letter to a student, sort of confirming, yes, we do believe it is permitted, and this letter gets, whether it's deliberately or somehow it gets into the hands of the Rosh Hashiva in Baghdad, who's very upset with the Rambam for sending these letters over to Baghdad, telling the people living there that traveling on a boat is permitted, and he writes this letter now back to the Rambam, and the Rambam is responding to it. So that's some of the background which we're dealing with.
Right. So we have this anonymous Rosh Hashiva who is debating Rambam right now, who's upset with the Rambam's psak. And I thought it was really classy, actually, how the Rambam opened up his letter. I'll just take one sentence out here. He says, Hayinu smeichim bezeh im heishav tshuva amitis. If you're bringing something new to our attention that we weren't aware of, we're not upset. You don't have to apologize. Apparently, this Rosh Hashiva, even though he vehemently disagreed, he put in a lot of pleasantries in there to soften the blow. And Rambam saying you don't need to apologize, but it's a little unclear if it's like a passive aggressive.
Taking someone of Rambam's stature in open combat. But it's actually, and this is the sort of nugget that we really talk about that comes out in some of the letters, which you wouldn't find in Mishnah Torah. This is the Rambam welcoming criticism, saying, yeah, I'm more than happy for you to send a letter over critiquing my psak. If I've got something wrong, I can learn from it. And if not, well, we've gained from it. We've been talking in Torah. We've clarified the matter in the process.
Right. And then he turns around and he says, and the same applies to you. And now that I'm offering a rebuttal, I hope it will be taken the same way. It reminds me a little bit. There's this tshuva. I think it's the first tshuva there. Moshe Feinstein deals with about Maris Ayin, about him getting a ride during the 18 minutes to shul, and someone apparently thought that it's the 18 minutes of Shabbos, not the 18 minutes before Shabbos, and he thought it was usher. So Ramosha opens up his tshuva explaining what happened by saying, I just want to thank you for being mizdares, for coming with alacrity and jumping on the mitzvah of hochiach tochiach es hamisecha, the mitzvah of rebuking someone when they do something wrong. Thank you. And it's a little unclear if he meant that genuinely or a little bit more passive aggressively, maybe both. But I got a similar sense from how the Rambam opened up his letter here. Classy, and also I feel like a little bit of musar underlying it.
Definitely. So as we're going to see that this letter also contains some very, very important matters in terms of post-Talmudic authority, which is a big elephant in the room for all of us. We spent time learning the Gemaras in Yeshiva, move on to the Poskim. We have the halachic codes and the different Poskim through the ages, and we either are taught directly or we certainly absorb this notion of certain ranks of different Rabbanim. We've got the Amoraim, of the Gemara, we have the Gaonim, we have the Rishonim, who seem to be given some kind of status. We've got Shulchan Aruch, the Achronim, and the question is, well, what actually is the status of post-Talmudic poskim? How, to what extent, and why are they bound by each other? Halacha is a legal system, and any legal system must have clearly defined legal authority. So this is something also which we're going to me, this is the most interesting and the most important part of this teshuvah. I think before we get to that, maybe we'll just set out the two different positions a little bit more clearly. So the halacha of tchumen, as we said, is that one cannot move a certain distance, 2,000 amos at least, outside of one's locale, outside of one's village or city, shall we say. However, this does not apply if one is above 10 tefachim. If one's a certain distance above the ground, however, if one's on a path or a bridge or however that's going to be, it does not apply more than 10 tefachim above the ground. So that is one point. The second point is that it is not clear whether it applies on a body of water. If one's walking a certain distance, certainly one walks 2,000 amos, one has gone out of the Tchum, one's in trouble. However, if one is on water, it is not clear at all whether the rule of Tchum applies. And this is now the actual matter of how we're going to skim pretty quickly over the halachic the technicalities of the halachic debate, so we can get to the questions of authority. But the Rambam understands, and he brings all his arguments, that the going on a body of water on Shabbos is only restricted by Tchum rabbinically. It's an Issa D'Rabbanan. Therefore, if there's any level of doubt, Safek Drabanan Lakula, we are lenient. So when one goes on a river, he says, well, we can normally presume most rivers go at a depth of 10 tefachim or more. And if one has any doubt, then we go Safek Drabanan Lakula. But he said the way he's regarding is not even a real doubt, because you can't always measure exactly how deep the river is when you're traveling on it, but we can be pretty sure it's always 10 tefachim or above. And if one isn't, even if there's a genuine doubt, we can apply Safek Drabanan Lakula, and therefore traveling on a river from the perspective of Tchumen should be completely permitted. Whereas the Rosh Shiva of Bovel, quoting other Rabbanim from Bovel, understands that no, traveling on water is included in the biblical prohibition of Tchumen, just as traveling on the land. Therefore, it is a question of biblical law, Safek Doraisa, and therefore he wants to go L'chumra, he wants to be stringent, as we tend to in a matter of biblical law. The Rambam says even in biblical law, it's a weighted suffix, because we can assume that the river is 10 tefachim or more deep. But certainly, because it says the Rambam in a halacha of rabbinic law, we can be lenient in this matter. So that is the background in terms of the halachic questions that are being discussed. Before we get to the really juicy takeaways, which is the questions of rabbinic authority post-Talmud.
Right. So would any of their opinions shift depending on the kind of bodies of water that were around their locales? Would that have affected any of their reasoning? Or is this like purely just an abstract debate about how to categorize bodies of water and related to Tchumen?
So I think you're making actually a very, very important point, which I'll get to in a moment, because what really gets to the Rambam, what really bothers him about this Rabbi Shmuel Halevi of Baghdad's response is not so much the reasoning, because he feels that Rabbi Shmuel Halevi has not really responded to the points that Rambam has brought up. His halachic arguments have not really been responded to very much. What he does primarily, Rabbi Shmuel Halevi, is he provides a list of Rabbanim and Gaonim in Bovel who have all said, and they've all agreed, that traveling on a river is biblically forbidden, and therefore implies Rabbi Shmuel Halevi, you Rambam have to agree. So before we get to a question of, well, who is bound by whom in a post-Talmudic setting, there's a separate question, which I seem to remember Rav Asher Weiss discussing once in a similar way, that a teshuvah which does not go into the reasons, if just quoting someone, so-and-so said mutter, so-and-so said also, without explaining the reasons behind it, is of very limited halachic utility. For exactly the reasons you mentioned, because, well, yes, Rav so-and-so in Bovel may have said that traveling on the Euphrates or whichever river there is prohibited. Well, as you said, there may be particular circumstances there which explains why he was stringent. It could be that the Euphrates gets particularly shallow at some points when there's a non-rainy season, or there are certain things below the water. Who knows what the reason might be? But for the Rambam, if you're just quoting something on authority and you're not quoting the reasons behind the ruling, why the rabbis in Babel have said also, how can you tell us that our rivers in Spain and Egypt can't be traveled on? Our Rabbonim in Spain and Egypt have looked at the rivers here and concluded that it's okay. So if you have a reason, if you want to explain to us why the Rabbonim in Babel have said it's also, then we can look at their reasoning, we can look at their teshuvah, and try and assess how that applies to our situations in Spain and Egypt. But don't just give us this, well, so-and-so said Ossa, therefore all rivers are Ossa. Because we don't know, it may be a Harashah, maybe in a Minhag, it may have been some particular circumstance in that river. It's a limited utility for you to just tell us a list of rabbis that said, it's like saying a list of rabbis in America said this Eruv is Ossa, therefore Eruv in Europe is Ossa. Tell us why. Tell us the reason.
Well, that's actually what Rav Moshe Feinstein in his Akdama to Orach Chaim Chelik Aleph, as well as in two subsequent Chuvos, his opposition to his Chuvos being whittled down to mere summaries and bottom lines was that he said, my job as a posek was I wasn't going out there to paskin for everybody. Individuals came to me with their unique circumstances, and I gave them tailor-made responses. But how can I just reduce it to a bottom line when you're not taking all the considerations and factors into account, and then you're going to extrapolate it to a different situation entirely? And you know what it reminds me of? There's a whole new genre. I know it's a new genre, but it's a very popular genre these days. Maybe you know what I'm getting to, of Svarim. I don't know if there's a name for them, but like they'll ask, insert whatever gadol from the 20th or early 21st century who has since passed away, and we can't ask for clarification. They'll ask a very intense question with huge implications, and he says yes or no. And then there's like 10 pages of footnotes afterwards from somebody else explaining what went behind that yes or no. And I'm just like left there thinking, maybe he thought something else. So how can we extrapolate his yes or no in one situation to another?
Right.
I mean, it's good learning, but for halacha l'maisa, I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. I've heard many rabbonim complaining about their psakim to individuals being taken and copy and pasted all over. But unless a Rav sort of publishes a teshuvah himself in a sefer for public consumption, it's very dangerous to sort of quote it and apply it all over. So that's something which you highlighted, and I think it's part of what is getting to the Rambam, because the Rambam says you haven't explained if there's a reason behind what these Rabbanim have said, well, tell us what that reason is, and we can assess it. We may agree, we may disagree, but if you haven't told us the reason behind what they're saying, we can. I think the phrase he uses, we can neither uphold it nor reject it, because we don't really know what these Rabbanim are saying. We know Osir and Mutter, but we don't know the exact question they were referring to. So that's one very important point. The other very important point here, which I think is the main point which I wanted to look at this teshuvah for, is the way that Rambam responds to Rav Shmuel Halevi. We see many of the dynamics which are going on behind the scene. As I mentioned, there's a shift taking place here between the Gaonim in Bovel to the Rishonim in Europe and North Africa. And the Gaonim in Bovel, Bovel had been the seat of binding psak at the time of the Gemara. The Chasimas HaTalmud, Ravina Rav Ashi Sofer, everyone agrees, everyone agrees that Gemara, the conclusions of the Talmud Bavli, are binding upon everyone. But some in Bovel, some of the Rabbanim, the Gaonim, those who sat in the seats of the Amoraim, tried to, or they held the opinion that because they were sitting in the seats of the Rabbanim of Bovel, they had more authority than Rabbanim elsewhere. And therefore, they expected the Rambam, the Rif, and other Rabbanim in Europe and North Africa just to take what they paskened on authority. So in response to, we mentioned this list of Shmuel Halevi lists these Rabbanim in Bovel who've said it's also to go on water on Shabbos without explaining why. So the Rambam says, we've also got our list of Rabbanim in Spain and Egypt. He lists the Rimagash, the Rif, and I think some other Rabbanim there, and says, well, what is so much better about your list than our list? Are you saying that Mokom Gorem, are you saying that because you're based in Bovel, you win hands down? And Mokom Gorem is very cutting, it's ironic phrase. It's the phrase that the Gemara uses to denote the authority of a Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin, which is sitting, but Mokom Gorem is sitting in the chambers of hewn stone, the Lishkas Gazis. It has automatic binding authority. Are you saying that because you are in your your Lishkas HaGozis in Bovel, you're
Mm.
in your Beis Hamikdash at Bovel, that we're all suddenly bound by you. It's an ironic cutting statement, but really gets to the heart of the question of post-Talmudic authority. Because the Rambam is, if you look at now, having seen this, you go to his introduction to Mishnah Torah, and he spent towards the end of that introduction of Mishnah Torah, he's contrasting the rabbinic authority of the Talmudic sages, which he says is binding upon all of Klal Yisrael, with the authority of the Gaonim and the Rishonim and everyone post the Gemara. And he says the Gaonim rose up in Bovel, in Spain, in France, in Germany, in North Africa. And he's asking, why is he just listing all these places? You can see that this was a major point of contention of the Rambam's time, because there were Rabbanim in the Rambam's era who were arguing that these places aren't all equal. They argue that Bovel is superior in Psak because they've inherited the yeshivas of Bovel, and that the Rabbanim elsewhere, Rashi, Rambam, Rif, are all bound to the Psak of the Gaonim and the Rabbanim in Bovel. So some of these phrases you pick up suddenly are very potent.
So this is a bit of a paradigm shift for me, because I always thought of the claim of the Chasimas of Talmud, right? We draw a line between Talmudic authority versus post-Talmudic authority as a way of giving proper deference to the earlier generations of those, the Amoraim, Tanaim, and all those who were in the Talmud and earlier. Though it seems to also be cutting in another direction, which is by saying that we can't argue on anyone in the Talmud, it means we have license to argue with anyone who comes post-Talmud. So it's not just a chumrah, it's not just a stringency, but in a certain sense, it's a kula that Rambam is arguing at the same time.
Right, and this is fundamental. This is something I go very much into in the second section of my book. This is fundamental.
Oh, say the name of your book, by the way. I'm so sorry, I missed that in the bio.
Talmud Reclaimed.
It will be linked in the show notes, Amir Tzashem.
Thank you very much. So the second half of it goes very much into the process of Talmudic authority post Chasimas Talmud. Because, I mean, first of all, we started with what makes the Gemara binding. So you've got the Kesef Mishnah who says, well, it was just as a matter of Kabbalah. It was accepted. All of Klal Yisrael decided to accept it upon themselves, and they could just unaccept it again. But then there are others. There's Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. There's another Rav Jose Faor. I think it's also the position of Rav Shari Ragon and his Iggeres that says, no, it's not just a matter of they were generally accepted by Klal Yisrael, but the yeshiva of Surah, which Ravina and Rav Ashi headed, we see references to this in the Gemara that Rav Shari Ragon brings. All the other yeshivas of Bovel subordinated themselves to Ravina and Rav Ashi's yeshiva. They came to recognize the unique learning, scholarship, authority, and greatness of Ravina Rav Ashi, and they said, we are now going to be bound by them. And that gave it some kind of quasi-Sanhedrin-like authority, and it is that authority which allowed Ravina Rav Ashi to their psak to bind all of Klal Yisrael. And as Rambam writes in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, was after the era, I think it's 499, when Ravina Rav Ashi are off the scene, and the yeshiva in Surah breaks, there's now this intensified Golos, exile, and the Jews are spread out. And from then onwards, there is no more unified authority, unified yeshiva, and therefore each beis din, each Rav, is only able to paskin for his community, his locale, which is a major shift. So then you find the Gaonim. Is this? Yeah, so you wanted to.
So if I may, I just want to understand a little bit from a historical standpoint here. Maybe you could help me with this. So we have this. I don't know what you call it. Is it an event, the Chasimas Talmud, the sealing of the Talmud? You know, is it one day someone came into the base medrash, he gave a clap on the bima, he said, Rabbi Sai, Arkan Shas, weiter on to Paiskim. You know, like, where is it even clear, right? Even if we all fundamentally agree that there was this Chasimas Talmud, there's this line between the Talmud and post-Talmudic authority, was it necessarily clear, like, at when that distinction actually gets made? Because the Talmud itself took some time for development and went through several stages. Right. And then I guess built into that question is, you know, looking back from the 21st century, you know, you have those nice charts that are in a lot of yeshiva day schools where they, you know, the Rebbe puts it on the wall, which outlines, here's the Tanaim, here's the Amoraim, here's the Gaonim, let me have Reimer in there, Gaonim, here's the Rishonim, and here's the Achronim. And we have like these really neat distinctions from Gaonim, medieval and modern period, telling us who's in separate places. But was it clear to Rambam back then what the distinction was between a Gon, I guess they put it in their name, but a Gon versus a Rishon? What, I would imagine maybe that was like, oh,
I
now
don't
it's
think
the
the
year
term Rishon
1000.
existed then. I think he refers to them all as Gaonim. The Gaonim in France in his day, he calls them all Gaonim. But there's actually this wonderful quote from his professor Robert Brody. He lives nearby in Yerushalayim. He goes by Yerachmiel Brody in Israel.
Mm.
He's one of the leading historical figures, or one of the leading professors when it comes to the history of the Gaonim. And he writes, as probably was the case throughout rabbinic history, we may assume that the Savarim did not refer to themselves in this fashion. It was their successors who coined the phrase. Meaning he's saying that this is what happened each stage, as you talk about the wall chart, each stage in that chart was only confirmed later. Even the Chasimas HaTalmud, with hindsight, we can look back as the Rambam of Sri Ragon do and say, yeah, Ravina Ravashi, that was a sea change. There was a threshold, and we never moved back to that kind of unified authority. But yeah, you're right. In the years after the Yeshiva of Surah broke, it could very well be that the Rabbanim in Bavel going and thought that there's a temporary pause. Maybe another 20, 30 years, the Yeshiva and Surah will come back and will complete the editing and the Chasimas Talmud, which may be where this Rav Shmuel Levi was coming from. He believed that Bavel was the seat of the Gemara, was the seat of the Talmudic authorities, and it will be again at some point. It's just a temporary pause. Whereas the Rambam is saying, no, that those days are finished. We've spread out, and there's no longer any particular authority and scholarship in Bavel over and above the Rif and Rav Rashi and the Rishonim elsewhere.
It's funny. I'm not so well versed, but my sense is in more Eretz Yisrael and specifically within religious Zionist circles, they make an argument, but not vis-a-vis Bavel, but vis-a-vis Eretz Yisrael, that in terms of not being regulated and beholden to ideas that are coming from Gullus. Now, I don't subscribe to that, but I've heard that kind of
I've had this
discourse.
discussion with many people here actually who come from that school of thought, and the problem is that there's just a certain lack of historical evidence. As in, we know that the Yerushalmi was sealed, so to speak, or completed to whatever extent it was completed by Rabbi Yochanan. That's in the earlier, or maybe students in the earlier days of the Amoraim, the earlier generations. And then there was this great persecution because the Christians were in charge of Eretz Israel, and the primary scholarship moved over from Eretz Israel to Bavel. We find virtually every study, right? Amar Ravina, Amar Rav Yochanan, Amar Rav so and so, Amar Rav Yochanan. They're bringing all the main scholarship from Eretz Israel over to Bavel, and therefore the feeling is that the main scholarship of Eretz Israel is included in the Bavli. We don't find a lot of evidence of scholarship of yeshiva or yeshivas in Eretz Israel from that time onwards within the Amoraic era. That's not to say we can prove it didn't exist at all, but we don't find much evidence of it. So when the Rambam says that, or Rav Sharira says that the yeshiva in Surah represented was accepted by the entire Jewish world, can we prove that there were Jews in Eretz Yisrael that were protesting against it? I mean, in the Gaonic era, we find some people that didn't necessarily accept Bavli as an exclusive source, but there's just a lack of historical evidence about what was going on in the late Amorite period in Eretz Yisrael. We don't know of any great yeshivas there that could have rivaled the Bavli ones, but yet there's a certain lack of historical knowledge there.
Right. And so fast forwarding to kind of modern days, I find that there is this ambiguity, and maybe it depends on one's hashkafa a little bit, about the authority of Achronim nowadays. Achronim meaning like Rav Akiva Eger, the Noda Yehuda, and also talking about any Rosh Yeshiva, someone from the Moetzes Gedolei Torah and the Iggeres Yisrael who's alive today, or Rav Shechter from YU, whoever your go-to is. And I think the question is twofold. One is, does an Achron have a power to be Cholek? Can he argue? Can he debate and disagree with a Rishon? That's one question, meaning, is this distinction between Rishon and Achronim just something that we invented in hindsight? But really, there's only one question. Are you before Chasimas Talmud or are you post Chasimas Talmud? And then the second question is, if you assume the Achronim do have a certain level of authority, What is their power nowadays? Are they able to institute new gezeros? Can they declare a publicly binding fast day? I think that's one of the questions I'm wondering about, which is, are all post-Talmudic authorities created equal?
So it's pretty shocking to some people because of there's the hierarchy of post-Talmudic authority which we learn, we absorb in yeshivas, but therefore the position of the Rambam, quite possibly the Vilna Gaon, we'll see some quotes soon, is that yes, all post-Talmudic authority is created equal in terms of actual legal authority. Meaning, yes, everything, the only binding halacha that exists is something in the Gemara, which is why we find the Rishonim, whether we talk about the Rambam, the Raavad, the Rosh, they had huge respect for the Gaonim. You see what they write about the Gaonim? The deep path they treaded through. The Rambam considered himself far inferior to the Gaonim, but they were all happy to dispute the Gaonim when it came to halacha they didn't agree with. Very often, the Balei Tosfos will frequently argue on the Gaonim, but the Balei Tosfos will equally will argue very often on Rashi. So the Rishonim didn't seem to have this idea, which came along later, of binding authority in the post-Talmudic world. It only really started with the I think is the Balei Tosfos, which I go into. I'm not sure we'll have time to go into this now, but the creativity of the Balei Tosfos meant that there was much more of an association of the psak with the authority and the name of the Rav that gave it. This is something we can't go into so much. Also, when Kabbalah becomes more widespread, so the personality and of the tzaddik, of the person giving a psak, is very relevant. But really, and in terms of actual legal authority, the way the Rambam puts it, the way the Vilna Gaon puts it, there is no binding authority in a Gaon, in a Rishon, in a Shulchan Aruch. I can give you this quote. I actually wanted to quote this in my Talmud Reclaimed book, but I held back because I couldn't track it down. And
Now we get
I
the
tried
Torah
very
Shabbat
hard not
Pat.
to quote things I haven't tracked down, which I know it always annoys me in other people's books when I look up things and I see things quoted and I can't track it down. So I left out this quote from Rav Hershel Schachter, and then I found in his Divrei Sofrim Sefer, he actually brings it. So this is on page 45. His Rav Chaim Volozhiner, in his Teshuvas Chut HaMeshulash, cites a tradition he received from the Vilna Gaon. He asserts that when a qualified Talmud Chacham analyzes a halachic topic and determines the psak halacha with certainty, assuming this is based on the Gemara, and then sees that the Shulchan Aruch rules differently, the Talmud Chacham may not follow the view of the Shulchan Aruch. To do so, he maintains, would be a violation of the Torah principle, Leisisa Pnei Dal, Leisela Pnei Godol. Do not favor the poor, do not honor the great. Just as a Dayan is forbidden to tilt his judgment in favor of a litigant who is poor, so too in a matter of practical halacha, a Talmud Chacham may not paskin in favor of the Shulchan Aruch against his own conclusion. Meaning all that is binding in halacha is the Gemara. So again, I would be very reluctant. I don't think anyone would interpret a Gemara against if all the Rishonim read it one way and a posik today reads it a different way. I think we'd be very reluctant to think that we have got it right and they've all got it wrong.
Right. I think that's if I may, that's a very important point, which is there's a difference between Rav Hershel Schachter, who's a gadol, saying, I learned this Rishon and I think that there's something problematic here, versus Moshe Kurtz coming along and saying, oh, this Tosfos doesn't make sense, right? As every Masifta Rebbe, every high school Rebbe says, it's not a chesaron in Tosfos, it's a chesaron in you. You didn't understand Tosfos properly, which more often than not, that would be the case for me.
Well, I think it's interesting though, when you have a machlokes Rishonim, you have big Rishonim on either side of a debate. You got, say, Rambam, the Rif, and Rashi on one side, and the Balei Tosfos and the Rosh on the other side, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins one way. And you read the Gemara, and you are certain that the Gemara must be meant the other way. So you, as a posek, would be required to paskin the Gemara with the Rishonim that makes sense to you.
And that's what Rav Moshe always did. Rav Moshe that was like his signature quality, which was he ignored a lot of the Achronim. He kind of read the sugya and then gave his own unique psak in that way. We have a few minutes left. So, Rabbi Phillips, there have been a lot of very important fundamental ideas that you've touched on about rabbinic authority, about Chasimas Talmud. Is there anything else that you would like to leave our listeners with as we come to the end of our wonderful learning session together?
Well, there is one nugget that we've actually left out, which is that right at the end of this teshuvah, we see how moved the Rambam is, and we see the Rambam here as a posek, as a leader of a community, a posek for a community, not a sort of paskening coldly from the Gemara as he does in Mishnah Torah. We see that he's going on and on about how can it be that you are paskening a chumrah for a community, a chumrah which is going to affect people's financial situation. He says that even if you hold this as a din d'oraisa, the level of sophic is so low, at most it's going to be a chumrah to be concerned that the river may not be 10 tefachim high. Rivers are pretty much always 10 tefachim deep. So, and he's saying, how can you go and paskin a chumrah on a community? A chumrah is something which is for individuals who feel moved in a certain way to take as a stringency upon themselves. It's not for you to go and paskin it in a certain way. And the strength of feeling we really see the Rambam being concerned with the fate of individuals who are being pushed to be machmir, who are in financial difficulties, whether by being machmir in this area they'll end up being makel in other areas which are more serious. And we see the shikul, the weighing up of concerns of the Rambam here in his capacity as a concerns community rav, as well as the sort of, as we said at the beginning, the cold philosophical rationalist writing down his prescriptions for the Mishnah Torah. So that's another nugget to take away from this teshuvah.
And I think that's a really important point to leave our listeners with, which is Rambam was that great intellect. He, you would think he had that stoic kind of personality with the way he was able to just take information, organize information, distill information, and that didn't in no way contradicted, but worked together with his role as a community leader and passing halakha in a very sensible manner that made sense and was also backed up by his analysis as well. So, Rabbi Phillips, I want to thank you so much for sharing these very important ideas and concepts with myself and with our listeners. We're going to link your sefer in the show notes, God willing. And of course, I encourage our listeners to find more ways to learn from Rabbi Phillips. Shkayach, and God should give you much hatzlacha with all of your work.
It's a pleasure being on the podcast, and lots of hatzlacha with the continued sessions.
Amen.